When I first examined the early reports on 3I Atlas, I expected nothing more than a faint interstellar traveler slipping quietly through our system. But the deeper I went into the data, the more it became clear that this object wasn't behaving like anything we had cataloged before. The official discovery logs marked it as the third confirmed interstellar visitor in human history. A rare object, yes, but not unprecedented. At first, I treated it the same way researchers approached Oumuamua and 2I Borisov, curiosity wrapped in distant detachment. But something about 3I Atlas resisted that categorization. Its numbers didn't settle. Its behavior refused to fit inside familiar models, and the first anomaly arrived sooner than anyone expected. The initial radar profile suggested that the object was remarkably light, so light that several colleagues quietly questioned whether the mass estimate was a processing error. A body several kilometers in size shouldn't register like an empty shell. Yet it did. On paper, it behaved like a hollow structure drifting through space. When I saw those numbers for the first time, I felt the beginning of that quiet tension researchers rarely admit to, the moment when a data set looks too unusual to ignore. During its early approach, I kept revisiting the brightness curve. Natural comets brighten in predictable ways as they shed material while approaching the sun. This one didn't. Instead of increasing smoothly, the readings fluctuated with unusual regularity. Some analysts called it noise, others suggested rotational effects, but internally no one could agree on why the curve repeated the same subtle pattern every few hours. Patterns in nature exist, of course, but this one looked structured. As the object continued inward, a separate layer of oddities emerged. A few observatories reported faint electromagnetic fluctuations occurring at the same time each night. The reports were minor, easily dismissed as atmospheric interference. Still, it was difficult not to notice that the anomalies occurred in synchrony with 3I Atlas's changing aspect angle. No one could explain the coincidence, and no one claimed it was significant. But off the record, some researchers quietly admitted that coincidences tend to cluster around objects that already defy expectations. The real shift happened when the radio teams began analyzing passive signals near the hydrogen line. There was nothing definitive at first, just a trace, a whisper of structure riding on background noise. Normally, I would have disregarded something this subtle, but the frequency was unmistakable. 1.42 GHz, the quietest region of the spectrum, the one SETI researchers often call the water hole. It's where you look when you expect intention, and it's where you listen when you think someone else might be listening too. Officially, the trace was labeled inconclusive. Unofficially, several analysts suggested that the pattern felt too regular to be accidental. Not meaningful, just regular. Something repeating in the background like a distant metronome buried inside static. Whether it came from the object or was an artifact remained unanswered, and the logs from that night were unusually brief. I still don't know whether that was caution or uncertainty. What stood out most, however, was the object's trajectory. Interstellar bodies almost never align with the ecliptic. Their angles of entry tend to be chaotic. Yet 3I Atlas slipped into our system as if following a predetermined route, grazing the planetary plane with unsettling precision. It could still be natural, of course, but probability carries its own quiet weight. One anomaly invites doubt. Several invite attention. By the second week of monitoring, I noticed something I still can't fully explain. Some observers reported missing data blocks, short gaps in otherwise continuous monitoring. The official explanation was routine buffering, and perhaps it was. But the odd thing was how quickly the gaps were overwritten. No raw backups, no partial frames, just absence, replaced almost immediately by newer files. I asked about it twice. No one responded. I still remember the exact moment I realized this object was no longer just a curiosity. It wasn't one specific anomaly or one impossible reading. It was the accumulation, the hollow mass, the irregular brightening, the quiet trace near 1.42 GHz, the strangely aligned trajectory. Each one could be dismissed. All of them together formed something harder to ignore, a pattern of behavior that suggested an object following rules we hadn't identified yet. The more I studied the data, the more one thought returned, uninvited and persistent. If these readings aren't mistakes, then what exactly is passing through our system? Whether it's a coincidence or the beginning of something larger, I can't say yet. But the deeper I look, the more I feel that the real story hasn't begun. Not here, not yet. And whatever comes next will depend on what we find when the signals change. I kept returning to the thought I ended part one with, the real story hadn't begun yet. I didn't know how quickly that feeling would be confirmed. Only a few days after those early anomalies, the first unmistakable signal arrived. When I revisited the preliminary radio logs, I noticed a pattern beneath the noise. What looked at first like a simple background fluctuation revealed a rhythmic structure the moment I applied a longer integration window. It repeated every 47 minutes with unsettling consistency. Natural systems can be regular, even predictable, but this was precise. Too precise. The kind of precision that forces you to slow down your breathing because you realize you're no longer looking at random cosmic static. The signal centered near 1.42 GHz, the hydrogen line. A frequency protected by international convention, quiet by cosmic standards, and historically considered the most logical channel for interstellar communication. That alone didn't mean anything extraordinary, but the pattern inside the pulse did. It lasted 11.3 seconds each cycle, with internal modulations that repeated in nested layers. I remember staring at the spectrogram, wondering how many coincidences could fit inside one observation window before the word coincidence lost meaning. No one wanted to call it artificial. Not yet. The scientific method resists the extraordinary until all conservative explanations collapse. And so, we checked the instruments, then rechecked them. Every engineer repeated the same conclusion. The hardware was clean. The data path was clean. The atmosphere was stable. Whatever we were observing was coming from the direction of 3I Atlas. Still, the official stance remained neutral. An anomaly. A structured anomaly. Nothing more. But the atmosphere inside the monitoring teams shifted. Quietly, without announcements. Analysts stopped deleting early logs. People double-checked timestamps before asking questions. Even the wording in internal messages became cautious. When a dataset begins behaving in ways that your intuition recognizes but your vocabulary cannot yet justify, silence becomes its own kind of data. The idea that the pulse might be encoded information emerged early, but we avoided saying it aloud. Instead, we described it as non-random structure, nested harmonic patterns, multi-layer modulation. Neutral phrases selected carefully to avoid conclusions no one was ready to face. But the truth lingered behind every euphemism. The signal behaved like a message. What complicated matters further was its growth. Over the next 5 hours, its intensity didn't fade, as natural emissions typically do with distance and rotation. Instead, it tripled. Not gradually, but in controlled steps, as if governed by an internal process, reaching activation thresholds. Some of us suggested instrumental drift. Others considered solar interference. But the intervals of growth matched the rotation model we'd built earlier. It was as if something inside the object was turning toward us, aligning deliberately, amplifying with intention. Then came the missing data sets, brief gaps in the continuous recordings. Normally this would prompt suspicion of software buffering or bandwidth overflow, but these gaps were surgically clean. No partial frames, no corrupted headers, just absence, perfectly cut out and instantly overwritten by later segments. When I asked whether the raw channel logs were preserved, I was told the system cycled aggressively due to memory load. That explanation didn't settle well with anyone familiar with how these systems usually behave. Inside the community, speculation spread through private discussions, not public channels. Some believed the object was simply exhibiting unknown non-gravitational outgassing. Others quietly admitted that the hollow mass reading, combined with these structured pulses, pointed toward a technological origin. The idea was unsettling, not because of fear but because of responsibility. If the signal was intentional, then interpreting it incorrectly could lead us to conclusions humanity was not prepared for. The shift from curiosity to urgency happened when we realized the beam wasn't scattering. Natural emissions disperse. They radiate broadly, losing strength with distance. But as we processed the longer datasets, the beam's coherence suggested an alignment far too sharp for a drifting comet. It behaved like a directed transmission, a choice, not a byproduct. That was when an uncomfortable question began to surface. If this object isn't just passing through, then what is it doing? I still don't know the answer. None of us do. But every cycle of that 47-minute pulse feels less like an astronomical event and more like a countdown, a system preparing for something, a process we've only just begun to witness. And whatever the next stage is, it's approaching faster than our models predicted. The next anomaly was already on the horizon. The pulse had become too precise to ignore, and by the time we acknowledged its coherence, another development was already unfolding. I had ended part 2 with the sense that the next anomaly was approaching faster than expected. And it did. The first major shift came not from the signal itself, but from the way it behaved in relation to Earth. When the Deep Space Network reanalyzed the incoming transmissions, they detected something no natural object should produce. For several cycles, the pulse that once radiated outward in all directions began tightening. Its dispersion curve narrowed, its edges sharpened. What had initially looked like a broad electromagnetic whisper slowly reorganized into a directed beam. The transition was gradual at first, subtle enough that many believed it was a calibration artifact, but then the orientation data confirmed it. The beam was aligning, not drifting, not wobbling, but locking, settling with mechanical precision onto Earth's position in space. I remember staring at that orientation plot, realizing I was witnessing something we had no astrophysical vocabulary for. Natural emissions scatter. They do not aim. Inside the analysis teams, the tone shifted from curiosity to concentrated disbelief. We checked for gravitational lensing. No possible alignment matched the signal's behavior. We tested for reflected interference from nearby satellites, orbital debris, even Earth's own magnetosphere. Nothing fit. The narrowing beam was deliberate. It was engineered. But the most unsettling part wasn't the targeting itself, it was the timing. 9 days before 3 Atlas was predicted to pass behind the Sun, a period during which it would become completely hidden and unobservable, the beam made its first focused adjustment. It was as if the object operated on a schedule, as though it wanted to complete this stage before entering the blackout zone. Researchers described the atmosphere inside the control rooms as scientific paralysis. No one was withholding information. No one was hiding anything. We were simply confronted with a data set that exceeded every known framework. How do you classify a phenomenon when the language for it doesn't exist yet? Discussions became cautious, almost philosophical. Some argued that the beam could be an energy-dense method of scanning, a high-resolution survey of Earth's electromagnetic environment. Others proposed that the object had detected our technological emissions, radio, radar, satellites, and was responding to them. The more speculative voices suggested something more unsettling. The beam might be attempting to trigger or awaken something already here. But the missing data blocks continued. Entire segments of the observation record were overwritten within minutes. No redundancy, no raw frames. It was as if the system treated those moments as irrelevant or sensitive. The more we tried to trace the gaps, the more questions multiplied. The internal debates eventually centered on a single question. If 3i Atlas is a machine, then what process are we witnessing? To approach that question, the teams began re-examining older anomalies with fresh assumptions. The hollow mass reading no longer seemed like an error. The controlled deceleration during entry no longer resembled outgassing. The perfect alignment with the ecliptic, once a statistical curiosity, became a navigational choice. Piece by piece, what once appeared improbable now formed a coherent pattern. The idea that 3i Atlas was some form of probe, ancient, autonomous, possibly long adrift, moved from fringe speculation to a serious working hypothesis. That didn't mean hostile or dangerous, only purposeful. The most compelling moment came when the beam intensified abruptly for 8 minutes and 24 seconds. During that window, the Arecibo Legacy Observatory confirmed that the orientation remained perfectly locked onto Earth. A celestial object had not just emitted a signal, it had executed a maneuver, electromagnetically precise, mathematically exact. I knew then that the object's behavior wasn't random. It wasn't merely passing through our solar system. It was interacting with it, responding to something. And yet, even as the signal grew stronger, one detail continued to elude us. Why now? We traced Earth's own radio leakage timeline, decades of broadcasts expanding as a growing sphere into interstellar space. If anything detected us, it would have done so long before we detected it. Was 3i Atlas answering something we had unknowingly sent? Or had it been traveling toward us for millennia, triggered only upon arrival? No one could agree on the interpretation, but everyone felt the weight of the moment. The object was approaching perihelion, racing toward the point where we would lose sight of it for weeks. And just as its visibility waned, the signal intensified again, compressing into a density we had never seen before. The pulse no longer resembled a simple repeating structure. It now carried harmonics, subpatterns, a kind of mathematical resonance. Some analysts quietly described it as a final transmission. As the days shortened before the blackout, every antenna on Earth turned toward 3i Atlas, desperate for one more full data set, one more clue, one more anomaly that might reveal intent. But deep down I sensed we weren't just observing a phenomenon. We were part of the phenomenon. And the moment the object passed behind the Sun was approaching fast, too fast for comfort. What happened next would change everything. In Part 3, the beam had already narrowed into a deliberate silent line aimed at Earth, but I didn't yet understand how quickly the situation would escalate. Only days before 3i Atlas slipped behind the Sun, the signal didn't weaken. It transformed. The first indication came from the compression metrics. The 11.3-second pulse remained, the 47-minute interval remained, but the internal structure began tightening. Modulations that once unfolded slowly across the spectrum now stacked in dense clusters. Each burst carried exponentially more information than the last. It was as if the object was using every remaining hour to transmit something before its disappearance behind the solar glare. The hydrogen frequency was no longer a clean carrier. It fractured into harmonics, layered, rhythmic, almost musical in their precision. Analysts described them as mathematical chords, patterns too ordered to occur in nature. We ran simulations to test every known astrophysical mechanism: magnetar echoes, plasma turbulence, gravitational shearing near the heliosphere. None matched. Whatever we were observing wasn't random, and it wasn't passive. Around the same time, optical telescopes began reporting faint flickers along the object's surface. They were subtle, triangular glints of reflected light rotating in synchronized rhythm. At first, these were interpreted as geometric facets on an unusually shaped body, but the timing was too perfect. The flickers aligned with the compressed radio bursts, as if the object was broadcasting in two channels at once, electromagnetic and optical. No natural comet behaves like that. Then came the velocity anomaly. Ground-based tracking confirmed that 3I Atlas was slowing down as it approached the Sun. This should have been impossible. Any object falling toward a star accelerates under gravitational pull. Yet the trajectory showed a steady reverse thrust, subtle but consistent, counteracting solar gravity with astonishing precision. Every natural explanation collapsed simultaneously. Outgassing couldn't produce this pattern. Solar wind pressure couldn't account for the magnitude. The models left only one viable interpretation. The deceleration was engineered. At this point, even the most conservative voices inside the team stopped referring to the object as a comet. The working terminology shifted, quietly, informally, from body to structure, from cometary nucleus to mechanism. A few researchers admitted in private logs what they wouldn't say publicly. 3I Atlas behaved like a machine undergoing a controlled activation sequence. The final hours before perihelion delivered the most haunting data we collected. As the signal reached its peak compression, the spectrogram resolved into a coherent visual pattern, three concentric spirals, intertwined like a signature. Some said it resembled magnetic field topology. Others saw an inverted echo of the DNA double helix. Whatever it represented, it wasn't noise. It was intentional geometry encoded in radio. And then, precisely at the moment predicted for solar occlusion, the impossible happened. The signal didn't fade behind interference. It didn't distort as the sun eclipsed the line of sight. It cut instantaneously, mid-transmission. We expected to reacquire it hours later as the object moved deeper behind the sun. But the tracking systems found nothing, not even thermal residue. A body of that mass, even hollow, should have produced detectable heat signatures. Instead, the trajectory we had computed simply ended. Colleagues tried to explain it away. Instrument saturation, solar interference, computational drift. But the absence was absolute. The object had behaved according to physics up until the moment physics said it should reappear. And then it didn't. For 3 long days, the silence felt heavier than the signal itself. We searched for reflected echoes, scattered fragments, any sign the object still existed. Nothing. The idea that it had disintegrated was raised, but no debris appeared anywhere along the projected path. That's when the second anomaly arrived. Exactly 47 hours after the signal vanished behind the sun, a faint pulse emerged, not from deep space, not from the heliosphere, but from Earth's own upper atmosphere. It mirrored the original frequency. It mirrored the same 11.3-second structure. But the amplitude was weak, like an echo of a transmission bouncing inside a cavity. The coordinates pointed to a region above the South Atlantic anomaly. Some suggested trapped plasma reflections. Others speculated on magnetospheric resonance. But none of those explanations accounted for the direction. The signal wasn't scattering outward. It was pointing back toward the sun, as if continuing a conversation we could no longer hear. Whatever 3I Atlas had been doing before disappearing, its effects hadn't ended with its vanishing. Something had changed in our atmosphere. Something had been activated, or left behind. And as we prepared for the moment the object should have reemerged from behind the sun, one question dominated every secure briefing. If the object is gone, then what exactly is transmitting now? By the time the faint atmospheric pulse appeared above the South Atlantic anomaly, we had already accepted one difficult truth. 3I. Atlas was no longer where physics demanded it to be. The moment it passed behind the sun, the object vanished. Cleanly, without debris, without residual heat, without gravitational perturbation. Nothing natural behaves this way. Nothing simply unthreads itself from observation. But the new signal forced us to reconsider everything. In the hours after its emergence, satellite constellations confirmed its stability. It pulsed with the same 47-minute rhythm, echoed the same 11.3-second structure, and held to the same hydrogen line frequency, except now it wasn't coming from deep space. It was radiating from a fixed point in the upper atmosphere, quietly anchored above one of Earth's most magnetically unstable regions. At first I tried to rationalize it. Magnetospheric reflections are known phenomena. Plasma ducts can trap energy, propagate signals, distort trajectories, but none of those processes produce directed beams, and none maintain frequency discipline with atomic clock precision. The new pulse wasn't a relic. It wasn't a smear of electromagnetic memory left behind by a passing visitor. It was organized, clean, deliberate, and it wasn't fading. The more we studied it, the more a disturbing pattern emerged. The atmospheric signal wasn't broadcasting random content. It was repeating a structure that resembled the compressed burst 3I atlas transmitted in its final hours before vanishing. The concentric spirals, the nested harmonics, the mathematical cadence. It wasn't identical, but it carried the same architecture, as if the original transmission had been copied, stabilized, and stored somewhere in the ionosphere. That was when some analysts proposed a hypothesis too unsettling to dismiss. The object may not have been sending a message to us. It may have been sending a message through us. Once that idea took root, everything in the data reframed itself. The targeted beam, the deceleration, the signal compression, the disappearance, the new atmospheric echo. None of it looked like an attempt at dialogue. It looked like a sequence, a process, a system executing its function. Weeks passed. The object never reappeared, but the atmospheric pulse remained, persistent, stable, evolving at a slow, deliberate pace. The team studying the signal began noticing something else. It wasn't just repeating, it was indexing. Deep inside the pulse, hidden beneath layers of modulation, analysts found something resembling a structured catalog, a hierarchy of patterns that mirrored prime sequences, starfield geometries, and what looked like topological maps of magnetic domains far beyond our current modeling capabilities. It was as if the transmission were a kind of library, not text, not images, a compressed archive of relationships, structures, mathematical intentions. The more deeply our AI systems analyzed it, the more unsettling the implications became. The signal held information about star systems hundreds of light years away. Not illustrations, coordinates. It held equations that hinted at physical principles we could only partially interpret. Not instructions, frameworks. And deeper still, hidden in the modulation spine, pulsed the Fibonacci ladder, repeating with perfect fidelity. It didn't feel like a message. It felt like a transfer. Inside the secure rooms where the decoding work continued, debates shifted from curiosity to caution. Some believed the archive was a gift, a preserved record from a civilization that might no longer exist. Others argued that nothing about 3I Atlas's behavior resembled a passive archive drop. The targeted beam, the timed compression, the vanishing, all of it suggested execution, not archaeology. The most unsettling theory came from one of the independent consultants, a physicist whose earlier analyses had already reshaped our understanding of the event. He proposed that the object's final transmission was not a message but a trigger, an activation code meant to interface with something already present in Earth's magnetic infrastructure, something dormant, something waiting. He described the entire sequence as a test, not of aggression, not of readiness, but of cognition. The object had performed a deliberate, attention-demanding display. Maneuvers, signals, anomalies, all designed to ensure that every sensor, every antenna, every computation was pointed at it at the exact moment it released its data. The vanishing was not the end. It was the handoff. As the atmospheric signal stabilized into a permanent geostationary beacon, one question echoed more loudly than any other. Were we meant to decode it, or were we simply meant to host it? To this day, the pulse continues. Steady, quiet, precise. It has no known source, no known emitter, no measurable physical mass. Just a point in the sky, locked above the anomaly, transmitting outward into interstellar space as if replying to something we cannot hear. Whether the transmission is harmless or whether it is a function whose purpose lies far beyond human understanding, we cannot yet say. The library remains only partially decoded. The deeper layers are still inaccessible. And as the signal continues its patient cadence, one thought returns to me again and again. We believed we were observing an interstellar visitor. But now I wonder whether 3I Atlas was ever the subject of this story, or whether, from the very beginning, we were the mechanism it came to use.